A massive thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Be sure to visit the link in the description for a special offer that will save you 75% with 1 month free and get browsing securely. There are few phrases in the English language that could get me more excited than Hitman 2016 but more. The reboot of the long-running franchise was already up there as one of my favourite games ever, and despite apparently poor sales, the wrangling required to get a new title off the ground and the uncertainty that it would ever even happen made it all the more satisfying that 2018's Hitman 2 was pretty much everything I could possibly want out of a sequel. That is to say, taking that reboot's unbelievable level design and amping things up in numerous ways while making some slight tweaks to its mechanical framework in order to provide all new challenges as well as recontextualize the way you might look at previously established ones. At its core, Hitman 2 is still the ultimate power fantasy, with so many options at your disposal, but each one exceptionally balanced so as to avoid the emergence of a true dominant strategy. You know, outside of obviously choosing the lockpick for your loadout, obviously. You could blast your way to your target if you so wished, but you'd get downed pretty easily. Thrown weapons remain one of the most satisfying means of taking out a target in any video game, but come with the downside of a slow wind-up and need to constantly re-equip yourself. Given the verticality of levels and the web-like nature of pipe placement and grabbable ledges, you could avoid guards altogether and Spider-Man your way to your target on the top floor. But with the density of crowds on show, it's hard not to stick out like a sore thumb. And importantly, you could always disguise yourself, but as we'll get into with the maps themselves, they're maybe not the skeleton keys they once were. And so any playthrough of any particular map will likely require a combination of all of these different methods and more, meaning that when a plan goes off and you've thought creatively through each option's drawbacks, when you've reacted to the problems that will inevitably come up along the way, you know you've really conquered something. You're the master, using your array of toys to control the ants in your way. Mission stories replace opportunities but serve the same function here, giving you a guided tour through various and often wacky ways to dispatch your target. And while these waypoints are arguably more important to newcomers here than in the first game, given the decision to ditch the episodic model and dump a frankly intimidating amount of content on players from the off, what hasn't changed is my belief that, at least for the first playthrough of a mission, you should give yourself up to whatever wild situations your unguided exploration lands you in. Because this approach often offers the best of both worlds. A feeling of true mastery when you somehow manage to pull off the perfect movie-like assassination from across the map and get out unnoticed, as well as a descent into hilarious slapstick caper when something goes wrong, with the subsequent test of your reactions still providing incredibly tense gameplay, driven entirely by your own decisions. It's rare to truly be able to say that every player will have their own story as to how they took down a particular target, but with the amount of potential variables at play in any given scenario, I think you could say that with some confidence here. And you know, so far so Hitman, but with 2018's sequel, we see some slight alterations to the formula. What you'll probably notice first in that regard is the fact that grass and bushes now protrude from the ground, allowing you to make yourself more or less invisible to guards as you dive into them. Similarly, the series' borderline trademark large crowds now serve more than merely an aesthetic purpose, meaning you can go a bit Assassin's Creed should you so choose. These alterations, combined with the newfound additions of security cameras that actually alert guards to crimes, or the ability for NPCs to look behind them in a mirror to notice an oncoming attack, these things not only suggest a general move towards something slightly less uncanny than the responses characters would have to stimuli in the first game, even though I'd still never go so far as to call these reactions human, which given the game's sense of humour is absolutely a good thing, they also lightly incentivize more of a traditional stealth approach. Where 2016's game and those before it emphasised Mission Impossible-esque hiding in plain sight using the disguise system to blend in where you might not belong, mechanics like this change that slightly to just straight up hiding. Thankfully, rather than stripping the series of its personality, and while some of these changes are better implemented than others, the viability of multiple different playstyles is suddenly greatly expanded. A feature like the briefcase, for example, allows you to carry a sniper rifle without arousing suspicion if you want to take your targets out from a distance as a more traditional Hitman might, something 2016's game rarely allowed for. Oh, and also the briefcase is daft as heck check in itself and the developers didn't fix it because it's amazing, and that's because this game is really overtly funny now. See, the changes between 2016 and 18 aren't merely mechanical, with decidedly more attention paid to writing and tone. The way objectives are experimented with here gradually become more overtly story-focused, and 47 speaks more than we've perhaps ever heard him, both in the game's cutscenes exploring the Illuminati-esque conspiracy at the heart of 47's origins, as well as during missions. A lot of effort has been put into turning 47 from the blank slate who didn't particularly care about the political implications of the targets he pursued, to a full-fledged character with something resembling a personality. He's still the straight-faced polymath we've all come to know and love. You know, he's still a medically literate drummer with the mind of an engineer, on top of being one of the world's greatest assassins, but as exemplified by his extra dialogue this time around, he's a little more self-assured in the goofiness inherent to that concept, playing more directly into the James Bond archetype seen during gameplay, with every NPC interaction suddenly turning into a tirade of gloriously euphemistic descriptions of everyday activities. Basically, all in, yeah, I love this game. It's Hitman but more, and we could just leave it there, but that's not what you're here for, is it? Apparently I made a video a couple of years ago that apparently some people liked for some reason, even if I like it less and less the more time passes, and apparently some people wanted me to go more in depth with this one to the point that it's my most requested video by a long shot, so yeah, okay, I'll do it. I'll talk about the level and mission design, but realise that part of the reason it's taken so long, besides the aforementioned content dump where previously I'd had a year to get used to each map individually, is because I didn't want it to read merely as a feature list of all the places it's possible to go. You can ascertain that yourself. Rather, with this piece I'll be looking at each level as something of a jumping off point, using the experiences I've had with each to talk about the game's wider design, the aspects I loved, as well as where I hope future levels might go from here. And as much as I adore this game, as genuinely iconic as I believe some of this map design to be, I always forget whenever I boot this game up that, well, the cool ass racetrack isn't the first level you encounter here. We've got to get them new players up to speed before that. And with the amount of content being shoved in front of players minute one, it's perhaps important to give new players the opportunity to ease into the experience, something Hitman 2's opening arguably could have handled a little better than it does. See, 2016's game had you play what was, in essence, 4 tutorial levels. The designers clearly felt it that important to hammer the core concepts of a game like Hitman into players' heads. You had the boat level, guiding you through basic controls and mechanics. You had the boat level again to highlight just how open-ended your approach could be, as well as encouraging the replaying of levels. You had the military base, which introduced opportunities, and while it wasn't portrayed as such, you had possibly the best tutorial map of all found in the Paris Mansion, which through subtle gameplay hints acted as a remarkably organic introduction to the disguise system, the linchpin of that game's stealth. And after all of that, you were finally ready to be unleashed on the game's more gargantuan city map of Sapienza. You'd been carefully taught everything you needed to know. And with that in mind, it's safe to say that, comparatively, Hitman 2 assumes you've played the first game already. As your boat lands on a beach, you're given a lengthy run up to an incredibly secluded and relatively tiny house, a far cry from even the cruise ship found as you hit start on the first game. Further, where prior tutorial levels acquainted players with the notion that crowds would play a big part in the preceding action, this house is empty. The closest thing to life seen here are the surveillance cameras, which you're instructed to summarily deal with, checking them off as if they were items on a list. As a tutorial, it's hardly as effective as the first game, whose prods towards certain areas of its maps are now replaced with text boxes alerting you to the fact that these things can be shot. Given that there's no one in the house, there's no way at this stage to introduce players to the fact that getting spotted by one while trespassing will actually trigger an alert, as opposed to the first game where it just affected your score. And even then, before that possibility could even become reality, you're given the opportunity to erase the footage anyway, which disables the security system. It could be argued that this is actually a pretty good indicator of how little this change to the purpose of cameras actually comes into effect during play, at least on professional difficulty. Outside of a couple of instances where I'd be more careful to avoid line of sight, I found that cameras generally were surprisingly underutilized in areas where you might be seen to be trespassing, meaning that the vast majority of the time the threat they posed was almost identical to the first game, a score penalty and not much else. But as much as this is a little disappointing, what this level does very well is convey a real ominous atmosphere. Even without the bodies in the garage, the grey sky hanging over everything, the silent, dimly lit living area, the indicators that people were here at one point but now aren't, it all gives off the vibe of something usually luxurious turned decidedly creepy. Where the first game's party vibes made you feel mischievous for being able to blend in, here you get the feeling that you really are somewhere that you aren't meant to be. And so you explore the multiple levels of the house, greeted by the occasional prompt to interact with an object here or there. Perhaps the idea of poisoning a glass sets your mind off about where said poison might be kept. Maybe you step on a toy and hear it squeak, a subtle indicator that sound may play a part in remaining unnoticed. Crucially though, all of this should be setting off alarm bells in your head that at some point you aren't going to be alone here. And this suspicion is further confirmed when, in your search for the files you've been sent in to retrieve, you come across a panic room with a bona fide weapons wall. The game is prompting you to prepare for an oncoming assault, one that comes immediately following your retrieval of the files, and suddenly you're tasked with murdering your target as well as making a clean getaway back along where you landed the boat. Suddenly, with all those guards storming the beach and filling up the house, the long walk towards your target at the start makes a bit more sense. Even if you have a guard costume, many of them are quick to see through it. It is literally their job to spot threats after all, forcing you to dart around the aforementioned new addition of foliage to keep yourself invisible before making your getaway. It's tense. After all of your carefree exploration, you're suddenly greeted with multiple enemies closing in on your position. You have to act fast once they're in the building, but as you attempt to make your kill and your daring escape the first time through, you might realise that there isn't actually any time pressure to prepare before enemies turn up. That said enemies are a mere button press away, they're totally in your control. And it's this realisation that turns the tables somewhat. The hunted becomes the hunter. Perhaps you take them on more traditionally the first time, but what if during your escape you noticed that messing up or alerting the target in any way caused them to enter the same panic room you'd armed yourself in? What if during your preparations you'd come across a roof vent with the option to insert poison? Your mind starts racing with possibilities and, as is key to truly getting the most out of Hitman, encourages you to go back and try again. And it is true that the second half of this level, after your preparations, does act as a slightly more effective tutorial than it initially lets on, in conveying what Hitman is really about. That said, I can't help but feel like it suffers from one of the same problems I had with the first game's intro levels, and why I thought Paris was a good enough tutorial on its own. That is that with the structure of its setup, activating guards and progressing to the part where you use carefully placed stealth objects in order to escape, it's a remarkably rigid set of events for a game whose main draw is arguably the chance for things to go completely off the rails. Hitman, at least as far as the reboot is concerned, doesn't really work like this. Its new features aren't really significant enough to dedicate a whole environment to their introduction when the same functionality is conveyed through crowds seen later on. And so, while it remains genuinely impressive, a testament to the skill of the level designers that even such a relatively throwaway level can still provide a host of tantalizing possibilities, when compared to the other maps in terms of design and tone, it's almost entirely unrepresentative of the game at large. It's interesting to consider then that, like Paris in the first game, there's a world in which the next level could have opened the game and introduced the core concepts far more effectively. Following that barren tutorial map, you're transported to something on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, a level that will go down as maybe one of the most iconic maps ever seen in a Hitman game. Contrasting the prior map's grey, thunderous skies and creepy vibe, what we're greeted with here is a party atmosphere, more in line with what you'd expect from a game that so encourages slapstick nonsense. While that intro level had interesting elements to it, it's really Miami that feels like the statement of intent here. With its massive, well-considered layout and ludicrously dense crowds that you can now utilise to your mechanical advantage, this really is Hitman, but more, bigger, better. It's evident in the sheer size of the map you're navigating, seemingly dwarfing the Paris mansion with its racetrack and surrounding stadium, VIP areas, medical facilities, and then on the whole other end featuring a multi-layered robotics lab. Aside from just being a really varied, vibrant map though, it also highlights a key difference between this game and its predecessor. That is that you aren't going to find any Helmut Krugers here. Let me explain. Paris's map was essentially a puzzle box of multiple floors, the solution to which was the disguise system, forcing you to observe the movements of guards and party staff to figure out which people had which floor privileges, take them out, and use their uniforms to get to the top. If you didn't want to deal with all of that though, you could always access Helmut's costume that allowed you into almost any area of the mansion unbothered, hell, even unfrisked. Similarly, there were a couple of other disguises throughout Hitman 2016's missions that allowed you fairly unfettered unfettered access to the maps they were found on. In Hitman 2, on the other hand, the Miami map is so comparatively large, its environments that disparate, that the purpose of disguises in one area simply wouldn't carry over to the other. Every area of the Paris map, from the kitchen to the dressing room to the catwalk itself, was in service of the fashion show at its core. Miami, on the other hand, has a racetrack on one end and a robotics lab on the other. A waiter isn't going to walk the catwalk, but it makes sense that they'd pass through. A flamingo mascot in a military weapons facility? Less so. It's an extreme example, but you get my point. The size of Hitman 2's maps generally means that a lot more thought has to go into what costumes you're going to use and when. It turns disguises into as much of a tool as anything else in your arsenal, something that has its own drawbacks that you have to keep updating to adapt to changing circumstances. In this sense, it seems dramatically similar to a real fan favourite map in 2016's game Sapienza. In retrospect, I think the reason a map like this was so well received is the diversity of purpose between the mansion and lab where your mission takes place and the city surrounding it. More than an enclosed space filled with clockwork AI patterns that served one function, the idea that not everyone was an employee in service of your target, that there are areas of this map you might not even see during your mission, made it easier to believe that this was a full-blown town that just happened to have a mission taking place in a particular portion of it. Similarly, Miami makes it clear that Hitman 2 really honed in on the whole world first, mission second approach this time around. Where Miami differs, however, is in the fact that its targets aren't localized to the one area of the map, making for a best of all worlds scenario in which the different areas are disparate enough in purpose for the world to appear like it would exist whether or not you were there to see it, as well as forcing you to adapt to the unique challenges provided by each area, where the Kronstadt building requires infiltration past more alert guards and the racetrack largely involves getting things done under the watchful eye of the crowd around you, and also avoiding a scenario where large swaths of content go unnoticed by players. There are little nooks and crannies of the map that require a little digging around to fully get to grips with, but in a broad sense, your mission requires you to at least dip a toe into both sides. What's more, while the two sides of the map are pretty different from each other, they're close enough together and offer enough verticality that perhaps my favourite aspect of any Hitman map returns. You can affect events occurring on one side of the map from the complete opposite point. My favourite type of challenge in a multi-target map returns, in which you can kill one person with the other person, and almost every part of the racetrack and surrounding areas can be utilised for some purpose or other, whether it be finishing the race early to get your target to a particular area of the stadium, or simply gaining higher ground to get a better view of proceedings. It's all in your control here, while the near constant presence of large crowds requires a little extra vigilance on your part. That said, experimentation and improvisation aren't exactly hampered here. The AI remains as dense as the crowds themselves, meaning you can conceivably angle your gun just right so as not to make direct eyeline, take out Robert from the stands, and immediately escape, changing costumes and leaving people confused as to how a human being can apparently disappear into thin air. Like I said earlier, disguises aren't the skeleton key they once were, but they're still incredibly useful and moreover incredibly fun to mess around with. Miami encapsulates everything that's good about Hitman, and despite its size meaning there are potentially a few little details that get overlooked, like why am I not trespassing when I infiltrate this merch stand that clearly doesn't belong to me, it's a small price to pay for a map that uses its size so much to its advantage. And after more or less opening with a map as large as Miami, a map that potentially dwarfs the biggest in 2016's game, the idea of somehow going larger than that seems untenable. I said in my initial video that bigger doesn't always mean better, and that size meant very little if the broadness of a map didn't share connective tissue of some kind, using Marrakech's mechanically static rioters separating two largely unrelated areas as an example. So the idea of 3 areas so distant from one another that running between them can take minutes at a time, regardless of whether they share some kind of purpose or not, sounds a bit like a recipe for disaster. With that said, the 3 main areas that comprise Santa Fortuna's map, the village, the coke lab, and the mansion at the back, all provide unique enough challenges to make the map compelling. Rather than the objective of the mission being simply to assassinate 3 targets, it really feels like the challenge is to navigate 3 discrete levels, 3 different styles of play unto themselves, connected through a dense network of underground tunnels and thick jungle, with each environment matching the different purposes each target plays in the drug operation they're all a part of. Jorge, for example, whose duties see him located at the drug lab, sees you navigating perhaps the best use of the new foliage feature in the entire game, as you dart through his plantation, singling out and picking off targets as if you were the predator. It's the most traditional stealth approach you'll likely need to take on this map in order to get close to your target. Andrea's compound, in which she runs the business on the other hand, is incredibly small and heavily guarded, so any kind of frontal approach will likely be met with resistance. Better then to use the surrounding village to lure her out. As she's dealing with day-to-day operations, she's in contact with the construction site down the way or aiding another target in unveiling his new statue. Essentially, you're trying to navigate her around her environment, getting her away from the guards so you can make your move. And once you do, the fact that so many of the buildings in the village are explorable gives you a wealth of potential hiding places, perhaps making up for the lack of any crowds with which to conceal yourself. You know, despite its comparatively massive size, Santa Fortuna is certainly a far sleepier place than Miami, leaving you vulnerable as you stand in the open. Finally, at the mansion, we have Rico Delgado, leader of the cartel, whose challenge largely involves getting to the mansion itself, with open environments and an incredibly heavy guard whose elite nature will likely see through your disguise, meaning you'll find yourself playing a game of reverse join the dots as you weave in between potentially suspicious foes. It's also the area with the most methods of approach, as it would seem you can't have a mansion in a Hitman game without some kind of sinister underground lab, this time housing a drug submarine, contrasting the luxury of what's above with the industrial, almost militaristic sterility of what's below. The mansion in particular is often an incredibly rewarding environment to navigate, with numerous ledges and pipes allowing you to bypass that one guard that just won't leave from outside Rico's office door by clambering all over the place. It's also one of the first real markers you'll see of the developer's ability to convey narrative through environmental storytelling, and an increased emphasis placed on incidental dialogue. See, Rico's mansion doubles as a museum, but not just any museum. As you go through and see what kind of objects are on show and listen to the voice clips narrated by Rico himself, you realise that this is a museum of Rico. Through exploration alone, you find that he's a complete egomaniac, turning him from merely an objective to be checked off a list to someone you're more interested in taking out. The writers have put so much effort into completely incidental dialogue like this that the vast majority of players might never see, but whose inclusion only serves to enrich the environment you're exploring. All in, Santa Fortuna is a map arguably defined by its size more than anything else, but whose wildly different sections and the styles of play they each require would probably allow for the best elusive targets and the like. But what was that? You missed the bustling crowds Hitman is so famous for? Well, how about we head to an area with the most crowd? Given that Hitman is arguably at its most thrilling when you're enacting mischief while blending in with a large group of people, it would make sense to set a mission in one of the world's most densely populated cities. I'm not sure I would say that Mumbai's map was quite the size of Santa Fortuna, but thanks to its density, it can often feel like it. A lot of the time you can barely move for people here. And given how large the map still is, with its rail yard at one end and slums at the other, with underground tunnels connecting it all and converging on an utterly massive central structure of a construction site turned movie studio, the fact it can maintain that claustrophobia throughout the entirety of your exploration, the fact that you can enter so many of these extremely varied buildings and find yourself stumbling into some truly wild gameplay scenarios, sees the map bursting with possibility. Here we have 3 targets yet again, all thematically connected, but in terms of the game's systems might as well be entirely separate. I'm not sure they ever cross paths. The closest they ever come to being mechanically connected is in one of the mission's stories in which you have to aid another assassin, lining up shots and making sure people are standing in the right place for him to do the deed without noticing your presence. This might be my favourite opportunity across the reboot generally. Not only is it an interesting twist on your playstyle, giving you a streamlined path through all 3 targets, forcing you to navigate each area of the map, while also requiring you to take on multiple different roles with their own challenges attached to them, it also highlights through gameplay the fact that, well, this assassin is terrible at their job. They can't even focus a rifle right. And while Mumbai's map is impressive in itself, it's how the mission forces you to think differently about concepts you may have gotten used to over your playtime that to me is the real star of the show here. It's in Mumbai that we see the game really begin to experiment with secondary objectives, something the series has dabbled with before but never really fleshed out. Instead of simply being tasked with killing 3 people, one of those people doesn't have a face to put to the name. Suddenly, in a series where you can usually press a button and see your target wherever they may be on a map, here you're left to your own devices, introducing an element of detective work on top of your duties as an assassin. It's a really interesting concept that the developers flesh out remarkably well for their first go-around at this kind of thing. In order that the challenge remains during future playthroughs, his clothing is randomly generated each time, meaning you can't just pick him out from what you knew about him last time. Moreover, it turns the massive crowds in front of you into as much of a hindrance as they are a useful tool. In order to identify the Maelstrom, you have to get close enough to persons of interest, all while avoiding members of his gang who are roaming the streets searching for people who look like assassins. And so, you find yourself occasionally ducking behind people as cover, while also trying to single out a particular NPC in this sea of people. As far as the other targets are concerned, however, here we have more examples of the developers making these people flat out detestable. On the one end of the map, you have Sha, who will viciously reprimand her workers simply for drinking water. And what I like about this is the gameplay implications. One opportunity allows you to dress as the new foreman of the factory before being granted a meeting with your target. As you're being led through the factory and overhear whispers of how long the guards think this new guy will possibly last under someone as callous as Sha, the option to grant her workers a break pops up. Something they'll thank you for, right up until the point you actually meet her and she chides them for costing her money. After that, the same prompt will be greeted with a much more nervous response. Suddenly, these workers are a lot keener to get back to the job. After you've gotten so used to being able to mess around with the world as you like, her words take that away from you. She's that powerful. Similarly, and just as Rico Delgado's shrine to himself highlighted just how much of a narcissist he was, I enjoy the fact that mission stories involving triggering an event by talking to film producer Rangan frequently had me hammering on G only to be told the guy was busy. Usually event triggers will supersede any dialogue your target might be engaged in, but here you have to wait until he's done. You can't get a word in edgewise. Just like everyone else on this set has to deal with his ludicrous demands and threats, you can't even kill this dude without being forced to endure his bluster. But when you do finally get to take these people out, it makes it all the more satisfying. All of this is to say that while the size of the map alone is impressive, it's what Mumbai does to offer new challenges by slightly altering the purpose of mechanics we've grown used to. How it can convey important narrative details through the most minute of mechanical interactions that really makes it stand out for me. If future Hitman titles want to change things up in terms of what we're doing on a mission-to-mission basis outside of just killing people, I really hope it's Mumbai they turn to for inspiration, because it really is fantastic. It's just a shame that the next map, as much as it pains me to say it about such a promising concept, turns out to be comparatively less than stellar. But before we get into that, you know what is stellar? Today's sponsor, NordVPN. With the internet being the existential hellscape it currently is, with terrible EU copyright legislation looming on the horizon, and companies seemingly selling your data off left and right, taking back control of your browsing data with a VPN is more important now than it ever has been. Luckily, Nord has your back with over 5,500 super fast servers across over 60 countries just a click away, allowing you to access the internet as if you were in another country, offering military-grade encryption and no data logging, meaning you can be safe in the knowledge that your privacy is being protected while browsing online. And what's more, if you head to nordvpn.com/writing and use the code WRITING at checkout, you can get 75% off a 3-year plan that's only $2.99 a month, with an extra month free just for using that code. With a 30-day money-back guarantee, what have you got to lose? Once again, checking out nordvpn.com/writing and using the code WRITING really helps the show, and I'm super appreciative of those of you who do. Now back to the video. What were we talking about? Oh yeah, the next level being comparatively less than stellar. A New Life, found in Blood Money, is one of the most memorable maps across all of Hitman. This should be a no-brainer, we're in the suburbs again. It's fun to do things you shouldn't in this kind of environment, right? Well, yes, in older Hitman games that might have been enough, but here, not so much. See, in a game whose levels start off so densely packed, so expansive both horizontally and vertically, for its penultimate mission to feel so comparatively flat and barren is a little odd. Aside from the perimeter housing roadworks or a swamp, this map is a small square with some houses on it. Some of them you can enter, a lot of them you can't. And as you'd expect from middle American suburbia, the differences between them are almost entirely aesthetic. Verticality, and therefore the extent of how widely you can affect the map, is limited to whichever floor of a particular house you happen to be on. And given that many of the houses can't even be entered, an already small map begins to feel even smaller. Instead then, the suburbs are more interesting to me as a lore type level, as an environmental storytelling experience. It's one of the more important parts of the game in terms of its larger plot, where 47 has just regained his memories and is now going after the former head of Providence to find more answers as to his past. With the typical Hitman approach being to loosely contextualize your reasons for being in an area before unleashing you to kill the target du jour, it really feels like you're here doing this for a reason. And what's more, it's funny. Another Life is the banality of evil taken to an almost comic degree. After all these cutscenes showing this utterly monolithic, technologically advanced organization with your target at its core, himself portrayed as some kind of hardened, enigmatic genius, once we get to him, what we find is an old man reminiscing about the good old days, waiting on a nurse to come and give him a sponge bath, getting told cigarettes are bad for his health. For someone who once ruled the world from the shadows, here he's boxed in. The problem is that, well, he's not alone, at least mechanically speaking. Continuing in the footsteps of Mumbai, where information gathering is key to identifying your target, here you have secondary objectives besides assassination, where the information is your target. And while I appreciate the effort to change things up a little, what these secondary objectives really amount to is retracing your steps and ticking the items off a checklist once your targets are out of the way. From the very little I've played of a particular new map, not enough to feature it properly in this piece though, maybe a future video, it's possible to recontextualize Hitman's mechanical framework to create scenarios where you'd, say, perform a heist by being forced to carry a particularly suspicious item in the open, for example. Mumbai managed to make its secondary objective more intrinsic to your interaction with the game. You needed to identify who you needed to deal with. So I know it's possible for the team at IO to provide us with compelling challenges that aren't just kill person. As it stands, the need to go through this daft, mechanically unrelated collectathon every time you boot up the mission becomes stale quickly. It's clear then that this is a level less focused on creating memorable gameplay sequences than it is about just existing in this place as 47, highlighting the irony of such a quaint little suburban town housing this plot to take down the former leader of what is basically the Illuminati. When assessed in this way, it works. The focus of the map converging on the yard party in the centre makes for a nice change of pace, countering the perceived quote-unquote safety of suburbia, that kind of no doors locked mentality that leads you to have an open invitation party and here comes this bald assassin ready to kill some people. There's even a mission story when dealing with the other target, the head of Janus' security detail, in which you disguise yourself as a real estate agent and give Nolan a tour of the house for sale. It's hilarious in concept for sure. The idea that you're playing a game about killing people in which you're currently explaining the layout of a house, except you're also inserting endless euphemisms as to how easy it would be to get blood out of the carpet, for example. And it all speaks to what appears to be a wider move on the part of the writers to more fully characterize 47 this time around, rather than have him act as merely a vector for the player. A lot has been made of the increase in 47's spoken dialogue this time around, as he calmly ensures people that this particular medicine will result in the pain being over soon, or that this selection of food is to die for. But we know what he really means by that. The contrast between the hokiness of these lines and the excellent deadpan delivery by David Bateson can be incredibly funny, but the more distance I get from the game, the more I can't help but think that something might be missing here. In my eyes, better than the suave, sophisticated 47, who can eloquently turn everything into a murder euphemism like some kind of sadistic James Bond, I'm more into the weird alien man who talks like he's just discovered the purpose of a living room for the first time. The writers, while working on this game, clearly saw the response players had when performing all these wacky, inhuman feats, thought this is a comedy game now, and placed 47 firmly in the role of mischief maker to reflect that. I personally found it a lot funnier, however, when it felt like 47 was earnestly reacting to being put in situations spiraling comically out of his control, whose absurdity compounded on itself the more players messed up. His deadpan delivery and dead eyes hiding unbearable anxiety and humiliation, presumably. Where a good degree of the game's power fantasy comes from 47 effortlessly toying with those around him, the humour of the game arguably comes from us as players toying with 47. I always imagine him thinking, come on, really, do I have to? As I assuredly order him to dress up like a goon and do a sick drum solo. I get that humour is incredibly subjective, and it's not like I don't enjoy 47's dialogue here. I think it's really funny. I just think that a lot of 2016's best moments in terms of its humour came from 47 somehow managing to quietly blag his way through my daft gameplay choices, saying just enough to remain unnoticed rather than showing off his razor-sharp wit at every turn. And after all of that, if it seems like I've spent a long time talking about 47's character rather than the level design of the suburbs itself, it's because there really isn't that much to say. Like Like I mentioned earlier, it's a big square with some houses dotted around it. In terms of its tone and what it says about the characters and story as a whole, it might be one of the most compelling environments to exist in, but mechanically it's kind of the opposite. Luckily, we have one more map to go, and it might just be the best one. While Miami might come to be known as Hitman 2's most iconic level, I think that similarly to Hokkaido in the last game, the island level of SGAIL concludes the game on perhaps its highest note. It's a real showpiece of great level design, something exemplified by the tour guide greeting you as you step off your boat. The developers want you to take your time as you walk up, really appreciate the majesty of what you're about to walk into, and then those doors automatically open. It's a rather unmatched feeling of ceremony as you're properly introduced to the 8-floored behemoth before you. Structurally, it's the Paris puzzle box design taken to its extreme, down to the tone of proceedings and the splendour of what surrounds you, with two vertically massive structures to ascend in close proximity to one another, and a party atmosphere apparent through almost all of it. Except here, the partygoers aren't just here for a fashion show. They're a bunch of rich assholes conspiring to tighten their grip on the world to extract more riches, with more sinister wheelings and dealings making themselves known the further you venture from the ground floor. Visually, the sleekness of the party, the dingy depths of its underground vaults, to the downright magisterial appearance of its upper levels and penthouse, signal that every area here is vibrant and distinct in purpose, with each of your targets operating in a different part of it. You have multiple different costumes that will get you to a certain point and no further, meaning that a lot of the time I found myself relying on the fact that the castle here can absolutely be a physical puzzle if you view it as such. It's a jungle gym, which saw me diving out of the abundant open windows and climbing pipes with the kind of speed that saw me get a little more daring in my experiments, knowing that I was never too far from an escape route should things go awry, leaving us with a map that allows for total flexibility in your approach and is also filled with NPCs you don't mind turning into collateral. It's perfect. Well, I say perfect, but the optional objective of getting the Constant down to the docks amounts to little more than approaching him after grabbing an item from one of the other targets and walking him down without event, if you want to do that. Again, a potentially neat concept to have a game about killing people feature an objective specifically not to kill someone, but there's also really no reason why that should ever happen, unless of course you're curious about if the kill switch lives up to its name. You're not really protecting him from anything, you are definitely the biggest threat to him here. There's no real consequence to not doing it, you get the same ending regardless, it really seems to just be a score thing. That aside though, this map was the point at which I realised how satisfying it is to climb buildings in this game, how good it can feel to realise that even if the path ahead seems insurmountable, there's always a way around it. It got me looking back at other buildings in previous maps in a completely different way, and is honestly what I've come to view as one of the most impressive aspects of each level's design, for how little the game actually telegraphs the ease with which you can traverse these structures. And it all comes back to that key term, verticality, level design that incentivizes gaining the high ground. The castle represents this concept in its purest form, and seems to be one of the maps designed most with sightlines between the gargantuan buildings in mind. Like Miami, it really is a map where even the areas you'd consider dead ends away from the central action can lead to some of the most exhilarating moments. I don't think I'll ever forget climbing to the top of an old ruined building, wondering what the hell the purpose of this section even was, before realising that it lined up almost exactly with a window miles away that the target just happened to be walking past. Taking out a pistol then, and making the headshot from where I was standing, is almost certainly the best I have ever felt playing Hitman, fully realising that movie-like assassination I mentioned at the beginning, with 47 not even reacting, it's just another day on the job for him. And it's moments like this why I think that sightlines between different sections of a map are so important. They allow you to fully lord over your environment. This is a level that saw me work my way up through various disguises to the point at which I was influencing world politics as part of the Illuminati, and yet the most powerful I actually felt during proceedings was firing a gun. When your level design can do that, when it can make the most simple of mechanical interactions feel more viscerally rewarding than the most complicated, explosive scripted events, you know you've done something right. The future of Hitman after Season 1 seemed incredibly tenuous, but none of that seems to have deterred the team from upping their game here in almost every way. Even if I'm critical of certain maps, it's only in the context of what remains one of the best stealth action-adventure games ever made as far as I'm concerned, and just like last time, the quality of work on show here means that there is little that could get me more excited at this stage than the prospect of more Hitman. So I hope you enjoyed this piece on Hitman 2. Once again, I'd just like to thank this video sponsor NordVPN and remind you to check the link in the description to save 75% on a 3-year plan. I'd also like to thank my wonderful patrons for their continued support. Videos like this take a lot of effort and I really cannot thank you enough for allowing me to spend the time necessary to make it all happen. In particular, I'd like to thank Mark B. Writing, Rob, Nico Blakely, Sivas, Artyom Vitsyuk, Tommy Carver-Chaplin, David Björk, Lucas, Hebe Amore, Dallas Keane, William Fielder, my dad, Ali Al-Muhanna, Timothy Jones, The Nameless Guy, Chris Wright, Ham Megas, Zach Casserly, Samuel Pickens, Shard Fire, Anna Pimentel, Jesse Ryan, Brandon Robinson, Justin's Holderness, Matthew Natchery, Nicholas Ross, and Charlie Yang. And with that, this has been another episode of Writing on Games. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.